This is Fergus Hodgson with the Impunity Observer. I'm publisher, and I'm really pleased to gather today to examine the results of Canada's election, which was held yesterday. As many of you may know, the Liberal Party managed to maintain a minority or coalition government in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. And today we'll have people I respect who aren't necessarily big, let's say, loudmouths or shock jocks, but who have the intellectual rigor to really give us a sense for the trajectory. And we're going to have Meghan Murphy, Louis Groarke, Marco Navarro-Génie. Meghan, are you in Mexico still?
I am.
That's great. That's great.
It is great. Glad not
But
to
you
be
had
in
my
Canada.
favorite tweet or X post of the night saying you're excited about Alberta's future. So just for people who are not familiar, Meghan is a long-time journalist in exile now in Mexico who has been just really an independent thinker. And that's why I wanted to have her on, because she really has been at the forefront of new media and, let's say, getting out of the regime media or CBC thought police. So, Meghan, and you also were particularly relevant in this case because you ran as a candidate for the People's Party of Canada, or PPC. And so why don't you tell us what happened with your outcome? Did you get many votes? And were you able to get, let's say, a message to a wider audience?
I mean, my campaign was unfortunately thwarted by the unceremonious freezing of my bank account in Canada. So
Right.
I actually wasn't able to go back to Vancouver to campaign. I had zero expectations from the riding I was running in, which I know sounds strange as someone running in the Canadian election, but I ran in Vancouver East, which is, possibly the most left-wing riding in all of Canada. It's also my neighborhood that I lived in for many, many, many years in Vancouver. I still have an apartment there. And I left that neighborhood because it didn't feel safe for me anymore on account of my dissidence.
Yeah.
Specifically, my challenges to gender identity, ideology, and legislation in Canada. I've been fighting this for a decade, at least, more than that.
Sure.
So it's an NDP stronghold. And I knew that the NDP would win again, although, the Liberals actually did very well in that riding, much more than they have done in the past. So I got, 300 votes or something, which, considering the riding and considering that I wasn't there to campaign and considering
Did
that
you
my
crack
campaign,
1%?
what did I, let me take a look here.
Right. So Meghan Murphy has her own Substack, and we'll have all these links in our show notes. I've decided that I want to get her insights out to as broad an audience as possible. So, Meghan, but do you want to? I know you have strong opinions about this. Let's say the power of I call them regime media. You can say legacy media or mainstream media over this election, because it just seems like there's such a wide gap between people who consume alternative media or independent media and those who consume conventional media in terms of their opinions. And how much do you think that played a role in the outcome?
Huge. I mean, I think that the Liberals won in large part because of the Canadian media and the propaganda that they imposed on Canadians, not just during the election, but over the past 10 years. I mean, the reality of the media landscape, you have to understand, for people who don't live in Canada, is, it's very different than any other country because most of our media is government funded. First of all, we have a tiny media landscape, so there's very, very, very little diversity. Mainstream media is essentially progressive media, and again, heavily, heavily funded by the government in power, which is the Liberal government. So they were enormously biased almost across the board. There's a few exceptions: the National Post, Rebel News, True North. But the vast majority of other media is biased in favor of the Liberal government, and fair enough, because they'll lose their jobs if the Liberal government isn't reelected. Poilievre, one of Poilievre's platforms, he was saying he was going to defund the CBC.
Yeah.
He was going to put an end to government funded media.
It
So
really is. It really is a terrific challenge, or a very difficult challenge to address. This, it's about $1 billion Canadian from memory that goes from taxpayers to the CBC. And let's say you're starting, you're an independent journalist. Let's say you're starting an outlet. How do you compete with $1 billion? It's insane, right? It's just they can look slick, professional. And if you watch the CBC, which sometimes, maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, I do. Just the language they use, it has so many embedded assumptions that you and I would not agree with, right?
yeah.
They have an ideological slant, and you're not going to get, let's say, an Alberta separatist on the show. It's just not a thing. Or any kind of libertarian or whatever it may be, or in your case, let's say someone who believes in just a conventional understanding of what gender or sex is, right? Then it just is not on their agenda. Now, one thing I find a little bit difficult to understand, though, is that how many people even still pay attention to these outlets? It's very confusing to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I wondered as well, because I mean, obviously, these media outlets can't survive without government funding, and that's because
Yes.
not that many people are watching and consuming this media. But
Yeah.
at the same time, it's the boomers, because they haven't sort of adjusted to a new reality. I grew up on the CBC, when I was younger and I first went into journalism, my goal was to work for the CBC. That's what I
Oh,
wanted to do.
wow.
Before I became persona non grata in Canada, I had been on the CBC. I had written for the CBC. That was sort of my ideal in my progressive brain. And then once I began speaking out against gender identity ideology and became an enemy, I was erased. I was blacklisted by almost all media in Canada, except for, the select few that I mentioned earlier. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was that was, as you say, that was not a debate. Not only did they not want to engage in the debate, they just didn't want to acknowledge that it even existed because it didn't fit their narrative. I, at the time, was a leftist and a feminist. I don't identify in that way
Sure.
any longer, but so they couldn't have that because how they wanted to frame the debate was anybody who challenges this set of ideas is a far-right extremist, bigot, evil, bad guy, and we're the good guys, so we believe this thing. And that's, unfortunately, how so many Canadians seem to think. I mean, one of the tough realities about Canada and about this election is that Canada is so divided. Ever since COVID and the Freedom Convoy, it's been very clear to me that Canada is more divided than it ever has been in my lifetime. I don't recall there being this kind of animosity among people, and really very, very, very different visions of Canada. Very different visions of what Canada should look like, what will, make Canada a better place. And it's, we're really living in two different worlds, and it's troubling because I don't know what the solution to that is.
You are so concerned about it, especially with it leading to retribution, that you've left the country, and you did that in 2021, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So you believe in the gravity of the situation. Now, are there any ideas you have for this? There's basically demonization, which is used against anyone who shares an independent thought.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I left, and I'm serious. I was very concerned that I would be criminalized, certainly that I would be silenced and censored even more so than I already had been. The Liberal Party has been trying to push through this bill C-63, which is the Online Harms Act, which
Yes.
is essentially a bill to censor the internet and to criminalize dissidents. So it would allow any individual in Canada to report any other individual for what they consider to be hate speech online. You're then dragged through a human rights tribunal. You can be fined tens of thousands of dollars, or you can potentially be jailed or put on house arrest. And they would target exactly people like me, people who have been, pushing back against liberal government policy for the past decade. And so it wasn't only, I felt physically unsafe in my neighborhood on account of threats and stalking from trans activists and other leftist
Yes.
groups. But, on top of that, I was like, I'm not going to be able to work and I might end up in jail. I'm out of here. I can fight for Canada better, more successfully from Mexico, ironically,
Yeah.
than I can there. But, in terms of solutions, I genuinely think that Alberta should consider separation. Alberta is a very, very, very important pivotal aspect of the Canadian economy, and I don't think they really need the rest of Canada in order to maintain that. And were they to consider becoming, for example, the 51st state, which, Trump's rhetoric around the 51st Canada becoming the 51st state is obviously quite a bit of trolling. And I find it quite amusing personally. Other people not so much, but I think it's funny.
I don't feel offended by it or threatened by it, but a lot of Canadians really get bent out of shape about it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that Alberta would be so much better off. They have such different priorities and such different politics than the rest of Canada that it just doesn't seem to mesh. It doesn't seem beneficial for them to stay as a part of Canada, whereas it does seem beneficial for them to become a part of America, part of the American economy, and certainly beneficial for America. So I think that would be a positive move. I'm at the point where, Canadians made this choice. Like, you have to respect that on some level.
Well, so Megan, we have two questions. So one, just hold that thought, because I want to move on to Louis Groarke, but the two questions before that. One, after the pandemic, so you mentioned Bill C-63, as far as I understand, which is online speech, but there are other bills, as far as I know, that, let's say up the Canadian content requirements, or others that are used to suppress independent voices.
Yes. Yeah. They did. Yeah. The Liberal Party passed a bill a couple years ago, which handed over social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook to CRTC regulation. So this is a government entity, and it was responsible for controlling content on radio and television. So ensuring that there was CanCon, is so the story goes. But what it did was it allowed the Canadian government to dictate what Canadians see in their algorithms, and, what gets pushed forward, what is suppressed, what is silenced, what is censored. And it impacted me right away. I could tell right away that all of a sudden I was getting 0 views, 0 engagement on Facebook, on YouTube, all of these accounts which were connected to my, Canadian status, which I tried to change over since. But
I mean, Megan, and the irony, of course, is that you are a true, red-blooded Canadian. You just happen to be in exile now. And another quick question: is there a legal process for Alberta to separate from Canada? Now, this is a hotly contested question, but do you want to weigh in on that?
I think that there would have to be some kind of referendum. I don't actually know what the legal process would be, but I think that, they would have to hold a referendum and Albertans would vote. But I don't know.
It's a technical topic. I'll weigh in on just briefly.
But I do think it's a possibility, and I certainly think that there's a movement, and a growing movement towards that. And especially, to be honest, I thought one of the positive outcomes, I think the Liberal Party is horrific and reprehensible and disgusting, but I did think, maybe it would be a positive thing if the Liberal Party won, because it would push Alberta to separate. It would push people to sort of wake up and make a change.
Right. Well, I'll just say briefly that there are just let's say conflicting views on that. Some people say that Alberta can just hold a referendum or just secede unilaterally. The other view is that it has to go through Ottawa through the Clarity Act process. So there definitely is a legal process. This stems from Quebec in 1995 getting 49.8% in their own referendum, so they were extremely close. And we have the article referring to her, which was a news story, was Compliant Canadian Bank freezes account of exiled political candidate. And Megan, I just, we're in somewhat the same ecosystem here, but I appreciate this independent journalist space. And I just love that you can show your personality and be who you are rather than being, I don't know, an apparatchik for a major outlet.
I mean, I've made that choice intentionally over, again, since I've been doing this since 2012, my own podcasting and writing. I obviously do freelance writing for a lot of other outlets, mostly
Yes.
UK outlets, sometimes Canadian outlets. But yeah, I mean, I've maintained my independence all these years, which is a financial struggle. But I really value my ability and my freedom to come to my own conclusions and to really say what I believe without having to worry about getting fired or censored or, pressured in one way or another, so on and so forth. I can't lose my own job.
That's right.
I'm
That's
my
right.
own boss, so I'm not
You're not
going to
going to
fire
fire
myself.
yourself. But well, Megan, to be frank, I would love to speak to you for more time. We have to move on to our next guest. But thanks for sharing your presence or time with us, and I wish you well with your work.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and so our next guest is Professor Louis Groarke. He is a philosophy professor at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is really heartland Canada. Louis, tell us, mate, the topic we proposed for you was changing ideologies in Canada. Does this mean there's any changing ideology, or does it mean we're doubling down? Is there any, let's say, ideological implication from the outcome?
I do think that there is something happening in Canada, but it's happening more slowly than in the United States, for example. But what strikes me is that the conservative side is more enthusiastic and more filled with energy than the liberal side. So the liberal side is, I think, securely in power, or not quite securely, but in power. But I do think there is a slow change, but it'll come very slowly to Canada, I think.
A lot of people have been commenting this morning on the impact of, let's say, US policy or the trade war towards Canada, and this uh, bringing up some sort of nationalism in Canada that is almost weirdly new or fabricated. Do you want to comment on what this new Team Canada nationalism actually means? What is nationalism in that context?
Well, I think that nationalism is odd in Canada. I think that to understand Canada, you have to understand that there are different regions. It's not just the same all over. So, the Maritimes, where I am right now, is different from Quebec, which is different from Ontario, which is different from the Prairie provinces in Alberta, different than Vancouver, different than the North. I think that the nationalism that the Liberals used in the election, it could be scaremongering. Trump came in, they got rid of Justin Trudeau just at the right time. And it's a very slick political machine. They use kind of the Trump fear, the Trump paranoia to sort of excite the base about this newfound nationalism. Not that long ago in Canada, nationalism wasn't a big deal. In fact, if anything, according to the elite, we were supposed to be ashamed to be Canadian because it was colonialist and it was white and it was imperialist and all that. So I think that really this was for election purposes. Um, there is a certain kind of nationalism in Quebec, and there is starting to be a certain kind of nationalism in Alberta. But I think that in terms of the election, it's kind of a short term. It was a nifty political move to get Canadians upset about Trump and forget, because Canadians were fed up with the Liberals, forget about the past and think that a Liberal would be better standing up to a conservative American president than a conservative Canadian would be in standing up to a conservative American president.
If assuming that you want to fight, if you want to go, go into a trade war with the Americans, which seems like a very dangerous endeavor. Yeah.
Ferg, I don't, from the discussion I see, I would say this generally. Again, I was in Quebec for both referendums. Nationalism is not really a rational thing. It's kind of, I suppose it can be, but all the stuff about the tariffs that I've heard and whatever, it's not careful economics. It's more sort of hurt feelings. How dare they do this to Canada? And I don't quite understand, Trump with the 51st state. I can just tell you as a Canadian, that's not going to work. I mean, I don't know where Canada is headed. There's a lot of tensions in the, because Bloc Québécois came back. And I had thought the nationalism in Quebec was pretty much finished, but it's not. And so I don't know what the future will have, but saying things like you're going to be the 51st state, that's just, that's not going to work. That's not the rhetorically correct way to go about to have closer ties to Canada.
Well, of course, the Liberal Party got in largely on a platform of being anti-American. So telling them you got to index them is not exactly popular with the voters. Although I should note that the Liberal Party got under 50% of the popular vote. So this is what happens in these first past the post parliamentary situations where you can be the governing party without actually having a majority of the votes.
Well, and actually, Fergus, I just looked quickly this morning at the map, and if you look at the map, you know, it's basically the North and Ontario and the Maritimes. They get the Liberals, and Conservatives are spread all over the place. It's a very blue map. It reminds me of the maps in the States. The Republicans versus the Democrats. So
yeah, but famously, the former Prime Minister now, Justin Trudeau, called Canada a post-national state or post-national nation. Would anyone say that anymore, or have the Liberal Party leaders just basically quietly memory hold that one?
I think, yes, what you said is correct. They've memory hold that.
But I suspect a lot of Canadians who voted for the Liberal Party would say that Canada does have these, let's say, values. Maybe you and I wouldn't agree with them, but that we're quote unquote tolerant, or we, promote
Diversity.
diversity. Yeah, these indefinable terms to some degree, but wouldn't they claim those are the real Canadian values? That's Canadian nationalism?
Yes, I would think definitely the Canadian persona is much more to the left than the American persona, except for the highly democratic Democrat states. But I don't know. I mean, again, I think the appeal to Canadian nationalism is not consistent. It's not very rational. Because, and I think Carney represents sort of this idea. It's sort of like the way Sinn Féin went in Ireland, which is to turn away from local, sort of strong nationalistic sentiments to some kind of vision of, sort of on the left of a society where workers rule, and it's good for everyone, but ethnic and national boundaries aren't very important anymore.
Well, I'm just thinking that one value that many Canadians probably would let's say promote or advocate is that Canada has a very, let's say, egalitarian culture. That's why we have this universal quote unquote medical system where they in many instances you're just not allowed to have a private provider because that would offer a better option. Don't you think that seems to have it's become that way?
Well, and that's I think Quebec is the one place where there is more private health care, but yes, it becomes an ideological battle. And, depending on where you are in the country, if you're in Alberta, you're going to think rather differently from somebody who lives in Nova Scotia. And part of what's going on too, Fergus, is that there are have-not provinces, and what happens in Canada is so a province like Alberta. The complaint has always been Quebec has lived off Alberta in the west and the resource-rich provinces, but certainly, it is part of the Canadian idea that the richer province really should support, at least to some extent, the poor province. And so if you're in the poor provinces, like the Maritimes generally tend to be, well, it's not surprising they voted Liberal because they're more in line with that way of thinking.
Louis, we've only got a couple of minutes, but How familiar are you with the term postmodernism? And is that the reigning, let's say, ideology of Canada's ruling class?
Well, isn't it interesting? It seems to me that this shows that postmodernism doesn't work. Because postmodernism, yes, to get rid of meta narratives, including nationalistic or patriotic, narratives where you come from a special place and you're proud of and you have your local customs and whatever. I think what you find is all of a sudden, when push comes to shove, those old ethnic, nationalistic, cultural, religious allegiances come to the surface. I had a very famous Marxist once tell me, Terry Cohen, he's deceased, but he was very famous. I asked him what was the biggest mistake that Marx made. He was a Marxist, a very sincere Marxist. He said the biggest mistake was that he didn't take into account ethnicity, culture, local allegiances, loyalties. Marx. This guy was a Jewish intellectual from Montreal, and his Jewishness was very important to him. Well, just for the election, so I think it was very shrewd of the Liberal Party to all of a sudden go back and find this sort of, sentiment and use it very effectively in an election.
Yeah, how seriously is postmodernism taken within the philosophical community or professional philosophers? Do they consider it philosophically rigorous at all?
No, I don't think well, there's different kinds of philosophers. I am what would be considered an analytic philosophers. They wouldn't consider it seriously at all. In English departments, in sociology departments, in French departments, that would be considered much more seriously. There's some what's called continental philosophy that takes it seriously, but I think professionally, what's called Anglo-American philosophers or Anglo-American philosophy, no, they don't take it very seriously. But there's bigger issues there than I think we can cover here. But again, the appeal to I mean, it kind of reminds me. It's before your time, Expo '67. When we celebrated Confederation, there was a big upswing of Canadian nationalism, and then I think that was genuine. But I think this has been manufactured a lot for uh, political reasons, and it has been successful, or not completely successful, but it has served its purpose. I don't know how deep all this is.
Yeah, well, it just we've got to move on, Louis, but I appreciate your time. And his book is The Good Rebel: Understanding Freedom and Morality. It's not a light read, but it is, if you want an intellectually rigorous review of what freedom means. It's a great place to start. So, Louis, thanks for your time.
It's great to talk to you, Fergus, and fight the good fight. It's great to have independent journalists working hard to give another narrative. Thanks so much.
So we've got Marco Navarro-Génie. He's one of my intellectual heroes. He is the author of a biography of Augusto César Sandino, and he's written Canada's COVID, which is a book about the policies during the COVID spread in Canada. It's such a fascinating time to be alive, to be frank, mate. So much is going on. But the topic we gave to you was the trade war or trade standoff. I'm not sure whether we can call it a war yet with the United States. And do you want to comment on whether this means an escalation with the United States?
In some respects, I think it will, especially since the Liberals don't have a majority. And so that means that they will profit electorally from continuing the conflict with the Americans, or at least not finding a resolution quickly. There is talk, for example, that Prime Minister Carney is going to try to sell himself now as a kind of world leader in an alliance against Trump. There is nothing worse than wimpy men trying to appear robust and manly. They are the worst leaders in a sense like that, people who are trying to prove something that they're not. And I think this is where we could be headed.
Now, will this be targeted at specific industries? Now, I know the Canadian automobile manufacturing processing plants in Ontario are always a sensitive issue. We always hear about how we cannot get the parts across the border and they're to be protected. And then we also heard about electricity being shut off. So, do you see particular industries playing a role in retribution or a tit for tat?
It is unlikely that they are going to be shutting off industries in areas where the Liberals have just received a mandate. So that means, in many respects, that the Laurentian part of Canada, Quebec and Ontario, are going to be better insulated. And what might happen is that the federal government is going to use products and industries outside that sort of center of support for them as a blunt instrument against the Americans, and that could include, for example, Alberta and Saskatchewan energy and agricultural products from the Western Prairies, right? So they have nothing to lose if they do that.
Is there a silver lining here in that maybe this will actually pressure the attempts to bring free trade between the provinces to fruition?
The government that is about to form under Prime Minister Carney promised that uh, interprovincial barriers in Canada would be dealt with by the 1st of July. That's a pretty tall order considering that the country has been around for over 150 years and no federal government has been able to erase them. It seems unlikely and kind of pie in the sky that this government is going to achieve that in just a few days.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of history there and tension. We didn't get to this position out of nowhere. Right? The different provinces have interests, let's say, in protecting their alcohol cartels, whatever it may be.
Yeah, and one of the key issues, of course, here is that um, the the government will have a strong ally in the Bloc Québécois. They have significant overlap in several areas of policy. Just looking at their platforms without knowing anything about them, one can sort of figure that out. But the reality is that interprovincial barriers exist because there is protectionism, and Quebec is rather extremely jealous of its culture and several things. So at the same time, their potentially biggest ally can become their greatest stumbling block. And so that is going to create an interesting dynamic, which essentially means that the Liberals might actually skate backwards and refuse or run away, I mean to say, from trying to deal with the interprovincial barriers because the Bloc will not support them in a lot of that endeavor.
Yeah, I did title this event "What is Ottawa's Mandate?" And do you want to comment on the intellectual affinities of Mark Carney? Obviously, he is a literate man, right? He's no slouch, but maybe he hasn't had to deal with the general public so much. So what can you expect from his, let's say, ideological inclinations going forward?
Mark Cartney is essentially a radical environmentalist. In the course of his career, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, he's essentially tried to create an order in which the financial world will dictate from the top down how to follow the green plan. And so he's no grassroots Democrat of any sort. You have seen him, for example, deal with questions from the public and from the media. He's uncomfortable in a situation in which he has to answer to people. He is very much a top-down sort of commander in that sense. Ideologically, of course, uh, again, the Bloc and he are extremely close on this sort of environmental doom. And so he is anti-conventional energy. He's kind of a pro pie in the sky. Renewables are going to take over. The economy will be remain. He is in fact following, in many respects, the footsteps of Justin Trudeau, but that's giving Trudeau perhaps too much credit. Trudeau was already following the plan and the advice of people like Carney, and Carney, we know, was one of his advisors. So there is a tremendous continuity there in terms of policy.
Right. And the Frontier Center for Public Policy does focus on the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And in this new era, with, as you say, a man who seems very comfortable with central planning through the financial system, so we're likely to see all the stakeholder management and ESG rear its ugly head, especially against conventional energy. What will or can the prairie provinces premiers do to resist or defend what they might see as their less favored industries?
What I expect to happen is that the rift between the western provinces and Ottawa will continue and perhaps widen. If if Prime Minister Carney wants to continue the legacy of Trudeau in many respects, the West, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, will have to continue their work of affirming their provincial jurisdictions and the power to essentially try to push back Ottawa out of their jurisdictions. Both provinces, as you probably remember, have issued legislation uh, where they are going to they're promising essentially that they will not abide by policy or legislation coming from Ottawa that interferes or encroaches on their jurisdictions. And so this sets essentially the stage for bigger headbutting between the West and the center.
How much capacity does Ottawa have to punish provinces for behaving in that manner? Whether it's, it seems like they would have all sorts of policy tools at their disposal, whether it's the way they hand out subsidies or differential taxation or the equalization formula. If provinces resist, will it just backfire on them?
In many respects, the biggest power that Ottawa has in the Canadian Federation is the financial power. It's the power to withhold monies from provinces that are not towing the line. That's where the conundrum lies because Alberta and Saskatchewan can afford, perhaps to some extent, to push back, and they're not so dependent on the federal government's largesse. Let's put it that way, and so they are more autonomous in many ways, and perhaps not indefinitely, but they can certainly withstand. The federal government cutting them off financially for a little bit, and to make a stand, and that will essentially constitute a kind of a crisis, political as well as constitutional. And I'm not sure that a man like Carney wants something like that on his record.
Is there any association of the prairie premiers working together, any formal organization like a prairie council or something like that?
There are some ideological divides. The premier of Manitoba is a socialist NDPer, and so there may be some affinities, and I think he recognizes that he's pretty pragmatic for a socialist. But the premier in BC is worse. And so the strong alliance and the strong sort of political closeness exists between Premier Moe in Saskatchewan and Premier Smith in Alberta. And that'll be, I take it, sort of the spearhead of the resistance.
It does appear that Danielle has already worked with the White House almost to facilitate or almost like run behind or get defense in terms of this trade war. That is that happening where Scott Moen and Danielle Smith are working directly with U.S. officials to try to dampen or ward off any kind of like domestic attack on the prairie provinces?
I think to some extent, yes. She's been completely vilified for, going around Team Canada, which essentially was the sort of confrontational approach to try to make themselves look electorally more appealing. Smith doesn't have a chip on her shoulder about that. She's quite confident, quite a confident woman. Liberals don't typically like confident women, and she's reached out to people in the administration to try to deal with them, not to cut specific deals, but sort of uh, to try to bring the heat down, if you will. But the liberals won't have it, right? That they are essentially profiting from largely a self-propelled crisis on the Trump front. Trump, they could have ignored Trump. Australia largely ignored him. Other people have, but no, they're profiting from essentially pretending that there is this existential conflict and that Trump represents, the demise of the country and whatnot.
Yeah, well, we've just published an article yesterday on how Guatemala, for example, hasn't even considered retaliating to US tariffs. And they're just trying to propose what can we do to soften this, challenging situation. And of course, Canada could do the same. But as you said, it's been electorally profitable to foment a conflict or a standoff. Now, we have Ian Madsen just trying to connect, but so we'll keep chatting while we have you, Marco. But I that is so. But what one question then, because again we're looking at the trade war, is how much leverage can the White House have over Canadian policy? Because I often see this as an opportunity to, place pressure on Canadians to open up in a positive fashion. So, do you actually see some kind of thawing of relations?
Trump has been a kind of a godsend to present day Canada because regardless of the sort of incandescent heat generated by silly Canadian politicians, what has happened is that Trump has essentially shed a significant amount of light on the structural problems of this country. And whether we want it or not, those problems are now more visible than they have been in decades. And that means that governments, regardless of their political stripe, will have to deal with them in one way or another. So, and Trump knows this. So he's got a strategic upper hand in that way. But the reality is, Canada and the United States are kind of attached at the hip. Uh, Canada is not going to move from this neighborhood all of a sudden, and so it has to deal with Trump. And Trump, as you know, is hell bent on restructuring not just North American trade, but world trade and the balance of power in and around the world. So he's got a much larger vision of what needs to happen. And Canada can resist it all it wants. But I think the politicians are going to kick and scream and then follow and toe the line to the extent that they can.
That final point there, Marco, about how much the Canadian political class in Ottawa are willing to take pain in this dispute is one that I find, intriguing. What I mean is that at some point, obviously, investment dollars and Canadians and maybe even provinces will literally want to leave, right? At what point will that pressure bring the change in Ottawa? You just say there's a long way to go.
Yeah, among some of these people, I've heard it say that they are willing to essentially not destroy but seriously impair the national economy to resist Trump, which again is hyperbole. I go back to my earlier comment that the central Canadian elites are going to want to resist Trump on the pain of the periphery, the West and Atlantic Canada.
Okay, we're really struggling to get Ian right now, but Marco, thanks for your time. His book is Canada's COVID. He has a great Substack. I'm a subscriber and really enjoy your articles on both the Haultain Research Institute and also just your comments on broader Canadian politics. You even have one, Civitas, one about Latin America, which you write from time to time. So it's a really, it's a wonderful source there. Follow Marco on X as well. We're doing our best. Marco, thanks so much for your time, buddy.
Not at all. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate you having me here. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks again to everyone who watched. If you're not already, follow us on all the different platforms, get our newsletter, and get full subscription. Until then, I will log out for today. Cheers.